This just in, you've been nerfed or buffed, but really you're probably nerfed if you're watching this video, because it has been announced that tomorrow, or at the reset on the 25th, big nerfs and buffs are coming to almost all of the classes, and the ones you expected to be nerfed have been nerfed. I don't know why I'm laughing, it's not funny. But let's check out what has changed for the meta, for the classes, for the specs going forward into the new week. Starting off with Frost Death Knight, that has received an overall 4% increase in damage across the board. Not applying to PvP, I'm not going to touch PvP at all. But this essentially kind of makes sense. Frost Decay was not anything surprising. I don't know if 4% is going to be enough. I haven't seen a Frost Death Knight since last season. Is 4% going to bring them back from under the grave? I don't think so. Moving on to Vengeance Demon Hunter, the most played, probably pushed with tank in Mythic Plus at the very least, has had a nerf where the deflecting spikes that causes demon spikes to increase the parry will now increase it by 10% rather than 15%. This is a pure AoE nerf, since parry mathematically only really has value when you're getting a lot of melee hits a lot of the time, and that's usually just AoE. Rating will probably not have any significant difference whatsoever. For Druid, and this is a big one, we have balance buffs for single target. Now, you might have seen people run Druid in Race World first, but if you haven't, you know that Druid balance in particular is terrible, has been terrible for a long time. I was glad to see Wrath being increased by 30%, Star Surge being increased by 5%. And with the Lunes chosen, the Lunar Calling increases Starfire's damage to his primary target by 160%, up from 100%. These are big single target buffs for Balance Druid. Well, big in the sense that they're just addressing single target, period. I still don't know if this is going to be enough to make Balance very competitive, considering that it's been almost at the bottom of the tier when it comes to raid damage and single target damage. Of course, this is going to be greatly appreciated in Mythic Plus as well, since you're not doing boss damage that much in Mythic Plus either, so it's great. We need more of this, and outside of a full rework, I guess Balance is gonna have to just accept these and just be happy with it. Be happy, that's all you have. Guardian Druid has changed a little bit when it comes to Druid of the Claw. Now, the Dreadful Wound damage has been increased by 20%, and the Empowered Shapeshifting increases Swipe's damage by 12%, up from 6%, so double the buff, and Mangle's damage was increased by 25%, up from 15%. And while Power Surge's bonus to rip damage has been reduced to 200%, down from 225%. Now, Druid of the Claw has been kind of the premier hero talent for Bear in raids, considering that you can occasionally swap into Cat, put a rip on the boss, do a lot of damage, go back into Bear, and they seem to have shifted some of the damage into its more overall generic / AoE version of Druid of the Claw. Swipe's damage being increased by 12% is probably not here nor there. I don't think Swipe is ever going to be good on Bear unless you buff it fundamentally from, the ground up, but it's still, very welcome. And Mangle's damage is probably going to be a little bit more significant, but they're taking away the damage from Rip so that they essentially reward players that can cat weave a little bit less, and players that struggle to cat weave without dying a little bit more. So that's kind of how the Guardian has been hit. Now, Devastation has had a long post for its changes. There is an issue that has been fixed where the final tick of Disintegrate would not benefit from Titanic Wrath or Iridescence when talented with Azure Celerity. Tickings and ticks of Disintegrate have been kind of like back and forth in terms of how they worked ever since Devastation was released. But we also have developers' notes. The Nerebar raid tier set bonus was too strong and was causing players to not want to equip new gear from Undermine. We're reducing the Nerebar tier set's effectiveness and buffing the new Undermine set to encourage people to use the newer items. This is fairly common. This has happened a lot of the times for a lot of the tier sets, even in this expansion, whenever the previous tier set offered you way more damage than the current one, and you kind of never broke your 4 set until very late, or for very high increases of eye level. That's not really the ideal gameplay, but That's just how the new tier sets are, bonuses. So the 4-piece now reduces the cooldown of Shattering Star and Eternity Surge by 1 second, which was 4 seconds prior to this. And the 2-piece in the Undermine will now cast Shattering Star at 100% effectiveness, up from the 50% effectiveness. And the chance for Devastation's Evoker Undermine 2-piece to now trigger is 25% more frequently. And the Undermine 4-piece increases the damage of your next 10 power spell by 25%, up from 20%. This is great. On one hand, once you go into the new raid again, and if you still have your old tier set, you will be weaker, and that doesn't really feel great at all. But once you get the new tier set, you'll be even stronger than if you already had the tier set in the last week. So it's a little bit of back and forth. It's kind of like a situation for people who haven't essentially transitioned to the new tier set yet. So keep that in mind if you wonder why your damage is a little bit lower with Devastation this week. Augmentation Evoker, the one that has lived and lives no longer. We have some developers notes, by the way. After our last round of tuning, we were pleased with Augmentation support capabilities, as that's the strength of the spec. However, their personal damage contribution is lower than we'd like. We're buffing their personal damage to bring their overall output up without further increasing their support contributions. And that means just damage across the board increased by 15%. It's true that Augmentation never really had crazy amounts of damage on their own, outside of potential PTR or beta phases whenever a new set of tuning came up and then it was nerfed again. But in terms of support, I have no idea if Augmentation support abilities can be considered support abilities anymore, but it is very clear that they're trying to find a place for Augmentation in the roster where it's not something that you will feel mandatory to pick once again, because ever since it was released, it was meta in pretty much every group possible ever, and that's just not fun. It's great to see that they're working with it. I'm not sure if this is going to bring it back into the fold as, you know, a reliably competitive spec, I would say. To be fair, I still want to see more Devastation than Augmentation. And for Preservation, we have developer notes here as well. Similar to Devastation, the Nether Bar tier set bonus was too strong and was causing players to not want to equip newer gear from the Undermine raid. We are reducing the Nether Bar tier set's effectiveness and buffing the Undermine set. So what that means is that the 4-piece from Nether Bar will increase the healing of empowered spells by 5% per stack, was 10%. That's a big nerf. Healing of all spells and abilities will be increased by 5% across the board for Preservation period. Spirit Bloom healing increased by 20%. Energizing Flames refunds 80% of the mana cost of Living Flame when used to attack an enemy target, which was previously 50%. So you can, from what I understand, use Living Flame more offensively and not have to brick your mana. Disintegrate damage will be increased by 25%, but only for Preservation, and Living Flame damage increased by 25% for Preservation once again. This is probably in response to a lot of the healers not having enough damage to compete with Mistweaver, which we will get to in a minute. So we're just bringing Preservation back into the fold in terms of the damage that it's dealing, which is great. I mean, if you want to do damage, might as well be some relevant damage, not just like wet noodles. Hunter, quite a few changes here as well. Beast Mastery first, we have developer notes. Beast Mastery is performing well, but we have a few planned changes to address some quality of life issues as well as a few bug fixes. Dark Ranger's Black Arrow periodic effect duration is increased to 14 seconds, which was 10 seconds. Now, I don't know what this essentially means. Is the same amount of damage from the dot extended to a larger portion of the segment, or do you add 4 seconds of extra damage of that dot on top of it? We'll have to see. The Withering Fire now prioritizes enemies that do not have Black Arrow's periodic effect. That's great, so you can spread cleave more. Then the Pack Leader fixed the bug, preventing lead from the front from increasing the Pack Leader's boar's damage. Great, more bug fixes. We know that Hunter had quite a few bug fixes for Pack Leader. Bugs actually in the list. And Withering Fire now fires 4 additional Black Arrows, which was 2. Wow, this is double. And I think that's kind of warranted, because if you have been paying attention, especially to our channel as well, we've talked about how Dark Ranger was very, very strong in the PTR at the very early stages of the game, and then it just got bricked entirely, and now we're seeing, surprise, surprise, more Dark Ranger buffs, since everybody's playing either Sentinel or Pack Leader when it comes to Hunter. Speaking of survival, we're increasing the frequency and power of Pack Leader's summons for survival to help make the hero talent more appealing, and that would make a lot of sense. At least in the PTR when I tested survival, the damage of Pack Leader was atrocious. First of all, a full-on survival buff of 4%, similar to Frost Death Knight. I feel like survival is doing way worse in terms of the damage department. I don't know if the 4% is enough, because the other part of the buffs are just in pack leader. Why the Dire Summon Kill command cooldown reduction increased to 2 seconds was 1 second. We already addressed the issue with survival having too many resources and procs. Now it seems that they've been fixed. Now they're bringing them back, so I don't know what the fuck. Now, the bear damage has been increased by 40%, boar damage increased by 40%, Howl of the Pack leader duration reduced to 25 seconds, down from 30, and fixed the bug preventing lead from the front from increasing the pack leader's boar's damage, so similar to Beast Mastery as well. Now, considering that survival mostly used Sentinel, the fact that they're buffing pack leader doesn't really make any difference, because you're buffing something that was not used, period. So the baseline of survival performance might not change that much. In the 4% overall, I'm not sure if it's enough, but we'll have to see. Marksmanship, big changes here as well. From the developer's notes, we have Dark Ranger's performance is lower than expected, so we are making some substantial tuning changes to bring them closer to where we'd expect. We'd like Phantom Pain to be a compelling source of damage and worth playing around in Mythic Plus and AoE scenarios, especially when combined with True Shot and Withering Fire. What changes? Explosive shot damage is increased by 15%. Yay. Volley damage increased by 25%. Now, I'm not sold on Volley's damage particularly, since you never really used Volley for the damage. You want to use it for the trick shot, but having it do damage makes a lot of sense. It's a volley of arrows that constantly rains on the target. It would feel great for it to have some baseline relevant damage as well. And now, big Dark Ranger buffs. Black Arrow damage increased by 50%. Yeah. Those nerfs on the PTR were too much, huh? Black Arrow periodic effect duration increased to 14 seconds, was 10 seconds, so similar as BM. Phantom Pain damage share increased to 24%, up from 8%. Bleak Powder damage increased by 100%. Now, if I'm not sure, this for Beast Mastery was doing quite a bit of damage, but for Marksmanship was very far behind. And Withering Fire now prioritizes enemies that do not have the Black Arrow periodic effect. That's great. I don't see the change in Withering Fire firing 4 arrows instead of 2, so I assume that the 4 arrow change is only for Beast Mastery, not for Marksmanship. We'll see how that essentially plays out, considering that Black Arrow can cleave with Trick Shot if you take some talents for Marksmanship. So maybe that's why. Mage. 3 lines of text. Arcane, all damage increased by 8%. We talked about how Arcane is terrible in terms of damage in both of our previous tier lists. Frost, all damage increased by 4%, in the same boat as Survival and Frost Death Knight. Fire Mage, all damage dealt reduced by 3%. That's about it. That is all damage nerfs that Fire is getting, which is great, because we've talked about how nerfing the top contenders too much can cause severe gameplay issues that we've seen with Fury Warriors and Frost Death Knights in the last raid tier, which affected them in Mythic Plus a little bit as well. But Fire is great that it's only been nerfed by 3%, because now we're going to the other elephant in the room, Monk. Starting with Windwalker, all damage decreased by 4%. That's it. That's all the nerfs we're getting. That is fan-freaking-tastic, because it's been a while since Windwalker has been great. That's fine. And the overall nerf, I think, to the damage was about 3% loss in single target, which is 3%. It's not nothing, but it's not that bad. The main change was with Slicing Winds that had the damage increase about 20%. Now, overall, even if you do play Slicing Winds build, you are still nerfed. You still lose damage. I think the Peak of Serenity community will have a sim that says you're overall losing 2% in AoE in terms of overall damage. We'll have these throughout the video. You probably have seen some already, which is fine. The nerfs itself are not the issue that I personally have with Windwalker, considering that it's my main. My problem is with the tuning of Slicing Winds, because prior to the nerfs notwithstanding, Slicing Winds was a competitive choice with Emperor's Capacitor and with other types of builds as well. Now it's going to be the only build, and that is why I was essentially afraid of particular nerfs, since the fact that Windwalker had build diversity gave it a lot of flavor and a lot of cool gameplay potential. I really hope that, sure, okay, tune down the damage of Windwalker, but keep Slicing Winds in tune with Emperor's Capacitor so that we have choices and swapping capstones all around instead of just having to play one for the rest of the patch. Mistweaver, another elephant in the room, maybe bigger than Windwalker, maybe. We have developers' notes. We're decreasing Mistweaver's overall damage while leaving their healing relatively unchanged. Spinning Crane Kick has still felt a touch weaker than we would like compared to the rest of Mistweaver's kit. So we are increasing the damage of Spinning Crane Kick alongside these changes. So all damage decreased by 25%. I don't think this will surprise anybody. Mistweaver has had very high damage output and way ahead of all the other healers. Bringing it down makes sense. Now, whether or not healers should have this low damage is a topic that we can discuss for another video. Whether or not healers should have damage period, because that would force people to actually deal damage as healers, and that's something that people have mixed feelings about. Jadefire Teachings now increases Ancient Teachings transfer amount by 250%, 15, and was 160 before, so the healing transfer is higher, but the damage will be lower. Spinning Crane Kick damage increased by 15%, and Awakening Jadefire now transfers 120% of the damage done. Previously was 110. So what happens is these kind of changes you will see across the years with Discipline Priests as well. Essentially healers that take their damage and convert it into healing. They tune down the damage, but they increase the transfer rate so that hopefully the healing itself is not affected, but the damage is just being reduced. Brewmaster, a little bit disappointing. Only a 3% increase to all ability damage, considering that Brewmaster was way behind the other tanks, not to mention the other specs in the game, so much so that it was losing big aggro to a lot of the DPSers. Now, to be able to maintain damage as Brewmaster, you have to work your butt off, and this 3% is not gonna put a dent into the problem, but it's a step in a good direction, so because it comes out as a package deal with the Undermine set bonus that increases the damage of your next 2 casts of Blackout Kick by 250%. That is a big buff, actually, because Blackout Kick is a very large portion of your overall damage. Very large portion. I've tested it. Now, Blackout Kick with Shadowboxing threads only really hits 3 targets. In terms of raid damage, I don't think threats is ever a big issue in raids for tanks. You can always just rotate taunt and things like that, and you're off tanking a bunch of the time as well, so it's not a big deal. It's only 1 target, but in AoE, increasing threat on 3 targets is not necessarily where Brewmaster was struggling, especially the targets that are hit by Blackout Kick are usually the targets that you don't have problems with threat. Obviously, there's 2 main topics to discuss here. It's overall the damage output that is just very low competitively, where you are actually thinking about, I don't care how tanky Brewmaster is or what utility it has, it just doesn't do enough damage. And then there's also the threat discussion where you are constantly losing threat. So it's a step in a good direction for sure. I hope we can see more. Paladin, holy Paladin, I have no idea what's going on here. So we have developers notes. Holy Paladin's throughput has been below our targets, so we are combining an overall buff with targeted increase to a few spells we would like to feel particularly more impactful. All healing increased by 3%. Once again, these buffs and nerfs are good. When it comes to nerfs, they're great that they're so tiny. When it comes to buffs, it's a little bit hard to quantify, because when you're buffing a small portion by a small amount, you're only increasing the difference by a very small amount. But when you're nerfing a big portion by a small amount, the difference is bigger. So it's harder to see if the buffs are going to be good enough, while it's easier to see if the nerfs are good enough or not. Word of Glory and Eternal Flame healing increased by an additional 20%. Light of Dawn healing increased by an additional 20%. These are decent changes. Holy Prism AoE healing damage increased by an additional 30%. Holy Prism single target healing and damage increased by an additional 50%. That's big. Shield of the Righteous damage increased by 30%. Now, one of the problems with Holy Paladin's healing, at the very least, is that a lot of the healing is very, very scalable and multiplicative. You have a lot of passives that boost the overall throughput of a particular ability. Increasing the Word of Glory and Eternal Flame baseline healing by 20%, for instance, obviously makes the baseline heals a little bit better, but that also means that all of the multipliers on top of it will be even bigger. So you see 20% here, but the actual number that you might see will be more significant once you're in combat. It still doesn't change the fact that outside of procs, cooldowns, and anything like that, Holy Paladin might still struggle to keep people up, or not be able to keep people up at all, period. The damage is really nice. We talked about it in Mistweaver. We want healers to kind of be more or less close together when it comes to their overall throughput. And for Red Paladin, Final Verdict damage increased by 20%. I believe Red Paladins were slightly struggling in single target performance, but not that much in AoE, so just seeing Final Verdict change, that's really great, and it makes a little bit of sense. Holy Priest, big buffs, everybody! Are you going to be finally good? Well, let's take a look. For developers' notes, we have our aim with this Holy Priest tuning is to increase healing from weaker spells and talents. We're also tuning up Oracle to improve its viability. Alright, well, that's great. I'm not a Holy Priest connoisseur, so I cannot talk too much about it, but I can tell you what changes. Prayer of Healing increased by 25%. Marcelian touched on this earlier in the season, where it's still not enough. Prayer of Mending healing increased by 20%. Renew healing increased by 60%. This is probably the number that you might want to see on stuff like Prayer of Healing. But we'll see how this plays out. Lightwell healing increased by 30%. Divine Image healing increased by 20%. Divine Image damage increased by 20%. Holy Fire damage increased by 20%. Renewed Faith now increases healing done to allies with Renew by 10%, up from 6%. Renews from Empowered Renew now heal for 120% more than a normal Renew, which was 60%. Now, you have to imagine that 120% will be from an even beefier Renew that's already increased by 60%. So overall, it will be even more. The Renew is a back and forth mixed opinion thing for Holy Priest because it's a heal over time for a spec that does not function on heal over time mechanics. So although it's great for Renew not to be useless, I don't know if this is the right way to go with Holy Priest. But hey, listen, if you like it, you like it. Oracle, Preemptive Care now increases the duration of Renew by 40%, more Renew buffs. Preemptive Measures now increases the healing of Prayer of Mending by 40%. And preventative, did I call it preemptive? It was preemptive. Preventive Measures now increases the damage of Smite, Holy Fire, and Holy Nova by 40%. Previously was 25%. Of course, this comes as a package deal with Holy Fire at the very least that also has a baseline increase of 20% buffed earlier. So overall, this will definitely bump Holy Priest a little bit higher. It's been very far behind the other healers, at least from what we've seen. So it's great that it's getting buffs. Shadow Priest nerfed by 3%. Now it's getting the same nerfs as Fire Mage, and I obviously don't think that they're close in performance. Shadow Priest is doing a lot of damage, that is true. And if this is the extent of the nerfs that we're seeing for the top contenders of the DPS meta, that's great. Hopefully we see more buffs to the underperformers. Discipline, probably nerfs. Lenience now causes Atonement to reduce damage taken by 2%, down from 3%. I feel like this always goes back and forth a couple of times. Each patch, each season, each expansion. Atonement now causes spell damage to heal all targets affected by Atonement for 32% of the damage done was 35%. Basically, you'll convert less healing from the damage that you do. Rogue, for Assassination, the Nether Bar tier set bonus, Vile Tincture now max stacks reduced to 5, down from 10%, probably a similar situation with Evoker and other tier sets that were overperforming. All ability damage increased by 3%, Mutilate damage increased by 40%, and Ambush damage increased by 40%. Okay, now there are definitely builds for Assassination that sometimes prioritize Mutilate more, Ambush more, whatever. There's definitely some cool builds out there. Having them increase by 40% is not an insignificant number, but I don't know exactly how much damage they would do baseline for this 40% to be a big chunk. Once again, this is not overall 40% damage and increase in single target, but just a little bit. I would imagine we'll probably have it on screen if the theory crafters of the Ravenhold Discord did any sims, how much this actually converts to in the overall changes of Assassination's performance. Shaman. Elemental. Developers notes. Elemental is performing lower than we would like in single target. Probably true, and our changes to Primordial Wave in Season 2 left it feeling a bit lackluster. Now, a bit is lawyer speak for it sucked for the majority of the player base. We're increasing the damage of several core spells and significantly increasing the damage in Maelstrom generation of Primordial Wave. I don't know if that was the problem with the Primordial Wave that people had. Lava Burst damage increased by 8%, Lightning Bolt damage increased by 8%, Ice Fury damage increased by 8%, Frost Shock damage increased by 8%, they're definitely not touching Earthquake at all, and Chain Lightning. Primordial Wave now generates 12 Maelstrom now, up from 3, now that's quadruple the amount of Maelstrom generation. 12 Maelstrom is not necessarily a big chunk of Maelstrom, but it is way bigger than 3, and Primordial Wave damage increased by 500%. Now listen, they might have guessed the damage of Primordial Wave or tweaked it by a little bit. They might have been off by just a small 5 times. 5 times, bro. 5 times more damage. All right, moving on. Restoration Shaman. Undermine 2-seat two-piece set bonus fixed an issue that caused totemic projection to apply insurance while using Surging Totem. That's funky. Wow, okay. And the two-piece set bonus for insurance healing has been increased by 30%. Great, not much to say here. Warlock, Demonology, all damage increased by 3%. We've consistently seen a bunch of specs at the bottom of the DPS pool having an increase of 3%. That still feels low, but Demonology wasn't suffering as much as, let's say, Survival and maybe Arcane Mage. Warrior Protection. Hey! Thought you escaped, huh? Shield Slam damage reduced by 5%. That's fine. Colossus, Practice Strikes bonus to Shield Slam and Revenge damage reduced to 10% was 20%. One Against Many reduced to 3% per target was 5%. Tide of Battle reduced to 7% per stack was 10%. And for Mount Thane, Strength of the Mountain bonus to Shield Slam damage increased to 15%, up from 10%. Well, Prot Warrior was, to nobody's surprise, an actual DPS spec in dungeons, which, let's say, even if I get out DPS by Prot Warrior occasionally, I didn't particularly mind it. This is a totally different discussion as to where tank damage should be. I actually think Prot Warrior should be the tank with the most amount of damage, considering that overall, in terms of a group raid or otherwise, it brings the least amount of value to a group, period, no contest whatsoever. So that's great, but we're definitely seeing changes up and forth, and this is going to be interesting to see how the meta changes, because some of these nerfs and buffs are not necessarily tiny, but they're not that major. Like, you're not gonna suffer, you're gonna be fine whatever spec you play. And if you're not sure what the meta is, you need to check our latest tier list for the DPS in the raid and kind of put these buffs and nerfs into perspective and see exactly where your spec will lie at the end of this week.